Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really get into the heart of complex ideas from, well, some pretty demanding sources. Today, we're tackling something big, the architecture of the ethical self, mainly through the lens of Immanuel Kant. We're using sources that see morality not as, a fixed rule book, but as this constant personal journey of becoming. So our mission really is to map out how Kant thinks we become good people. It involves looking at three key connected pieces. This idea of continuous self-improvement, the necessary role of repentance when we mess up, and how all that effort culminates in what's called self-affirmation. And a big part of this is what our sources call a revolution of the heart, a kind of radical internal shift. But we're not just sticking with Kant. We'll also bring in a counterpoint from Nietzsche, looking at his ideas on self-love, autonomy, and how that challenges the Kantian picture. Okay, let's dive in and unpack this whole project of ethical self-creation.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is how these three things, moral development, repentance, and self-affirmation, aren't just steps 1, 2, 3. They're deeply interwoven. They actually constitute the ethical life itself. Moral development is the ongoing effort, the project. Repentance is like the course correction mechanism inside us. And self-affirmation, that's the kind of achievement, the result of living as a morally constituted person. And the core idea, the thing we really need to hold on to throughout this, is that committing to improving yourself morally, that whole process of refining who you are, striving to be better, that's how you build yourself as a self. It's not just something you do. It fundamentally defines who you are. It's about character commitment.
Okay, that immediately frames it as action, right? Not just wishful thinking. So let's get into section 1, Kantian moral development, or MD. You mentioned it's this long-term ongoing project, needs constant effort. For someone listening, trying to, live a good life, what does this development actually demand from them day to day?
Well, it commands a huge amount of effort, honestly. It's relentless. That's why MB is really characterized as a continuous struggle, a lifelong struggle. And it's important to grasp, we're not just talking about polishing your habits a bit. Kant means a radical transformation of the self. It's central to what he thinks autonomous agency is all about. It's where you exercise your freedom in arguably its most profound way.
And this transformation, you mentioned it requires this revolution of the heart. What's the trigger for that? What's it fighting against?
Right, the revolution. It's needed to tackle what Kant calls radical evil. And like you hinted at earlier, this term is easy to misunderstand. It's not about wanting to be, actively malevolent or demonic. No, Kant's definition is much more fundamental, more insidious, maybe. It's the universal human tendency to, put simply, put your own self-love, your own inclinations ahead of the moral law. It's like a basic flaw in how we prioritize things. We have a natural pull towards good, Kant thinks, but we also have this powerful self-love. Radical evil is when we make following the moral law conditional on it, serving our self-interest first, instead of seeing the law as absolutely unconditional.
Okay, so radical evil isn't being evil. It's more like, when duty conflicts with what I want, my default setting is to find a way to justify prioritizing what I want. Like, I know telling the truth is right, but that promotion looks good, so maybe I rationalize that a little white lie isn't really hurting anyone and it helps me, which is, self-love taking precedence.
That's a perfect example. Exactly that kind of internal negotiation and reprioritization. So the fight against radical evil isn't really about outward actions initially. It's fought inside, on the level of our maxims. Maxims are basically the subjective principles we act on. They're the underlying rules we adopt for ourselves, reflecting our fundamental commitments, who we're committed to being. They're the blueprints for our intentions.
So if my working maxim right now is something like, I'll look out for number 1 and follow rules only when it's easy or benefits me, that principle sort of defines my character at this moment.
Precisely.
And the moral development project then is this constant hard work of spotting those self-serving maxims and deliberately, forcefully replacing them with ones oriented purely towards the moral law. Like replacing it with, I will do my duty, period, regardless of whether it feels good or costs me something.
Exactly right. That's the lifelong labor. Maxims are the language of our character, you could say. And when we talk about the revolution of the heart, that's the decisive internal flip. It's the moment the agent commits to reversing that fundamental order, putting duty firmly above self-love as the primary motivator. It's conceived as a kind of single foundational act of commitment, even though living it out, fighting temptations based on the old prioritization, that's the ongoing struggle for the rest of your life. And this also helps explain what Kant means by impure maxims. You might do the right thing outwardly, maybe give to charity, but if your underlying maxim, your reason is, I'll give charity so that people think well of me, then the action's correct, but the maxim is impure. Why? Because the motivation is still rooted in self-love. in gaining respect, not in pure respect for the moral duty itself. So moral development is this relentless push to make sure our internal commitments, our reasons, align with the spirit of the law, not just the letter. It's about purity of motive.
Wow, okay. That really does set the stakes high. And if our identity is built on these maxims and the struggle is lifelong, well, we're definitely going to fail sometimes. We'll adopt bad maxims or act on impure ones. So how does repentance fit in? You said it's not just feeling bad, it's part of self-reform for past wrongs. How does Kant make sure it's actually productive and not just, wallowing in guilt or some kind of self-punishment?
That's a really crucial point in his philosophy. For Kant, genuine repentance starts as an intellectual act. Even before the emotion kicks in, it begins with recognizing your guilt. But, and this is key, this guilt isn't just irrational feeling. It's rational because it stems directly from recognizing our own fundamental freedom.
Okay, unpack that connection again for me. How does feeling guilty confirm that I'm free?
Well, think about it. The very moment you feel genuine guilt, not just regret about consequences, but real moral guilt, you're implicitly acknowledging that you could have done otherwise. You're saying, I made a choice and it was the wrong one. You're recognizing that your action wasn't inevitable, wasn't forced upon you by fate or circumstance alone. It was a choice you made as a free agent. So by owning the guilt, you're actually affirming your own autonomy, your capacity to choose between right and wrong. We acknowledge, since I was free to choose the good, my transgression was truly a wrong. This rational recognition of freedom and accountability is the absolute prerequisite for any meaningful reform. Without it, change is just like behavior modification, not genuine moral transformation.
Right, that shifts the focus from just the sting of the feeling to the underlying responsibility.
Exactly. And that recognition provides the groundwork for sincere repentance. Sincerity, for Kant, means actively adopting a new maxim, a firm decision to ditch the faulty principle that led to the bad action, and then genuinely trying to reform your character based on this new commitment. So, true repentance has to show up in how you live your life afterwards. It provides evidence, maybe not foolproof, but strong evidence, that your will is now genuinely oriented towards the good.
But there's still pain involved, right? Guilt, shame, regret, those are powerful, often painful emotions. If Kant's so focused on the rational side, does he just dismiss that pain?
No, he doesn't dismiss it, but he reframes its purpose. He absolutely rejects the idea that the pain is the point, like some kind of self-inflicted punishment to pay for the wrongdoing. That would be asceticism, just suffering for suffering's sake, which he sees as morally pointless. Instead, the pain has to be productive. It needs to serve a moral function. Think of it as a kind of moral alarm bell. The pain of guilt or shame should shock you into awareness, motivating this inner commitment to do better in the future, strengthening your resolve to live according to your newly adopted better maxim. It's moral pain driving moral change. It forces you to confront the reality of your choices and your freedom.
Got it. So the pain isn't the goal, it's the catalyst for reaffirming your commitment to the moral law.
Precisely. And that's the link to self-affirmation. By repenting the intellectual grasp of guilt plus the commitment to change, you become acutely aware of your freedom, your agency. You acknowledge the moral claims others have on you, and in doing so, you affirm yourself as a moral being capable of holding yourself accountable.
Okay, that flows perfectly into the positive side of this. Self-affirmation. This seems to be the end goal, the whole point of this demanding moral project. If it's also focused on duty and struggle, how does it actually lead to, genuine self-worth, feeling good about yourself?
Well, self-affirmation happens alongside, or maybe as a result of, this moral transformation. It means you come to value yourself, not because you're successful or popular or anything external, but because you see yourself as a bearer of moral values and commitments. Your worth is your moral worth. And significantly, Kant talks about this process of self-creation, of self-formation, where the agent actively commits to giving style to their character. That's a fascinating phrase.
Giving style to character. Yeah, that sounds almost aesthetic, like you're crafting yourself.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it's style guided by reason, not just personal taste. It means deliberately shaping your moral identity, establishing a consistent, reliable pattern of acting based on the good maxims you've chosen. You define who you fundamentally are by the principles you commit to upholding, unconditionally.
So the style has to conform strictly to the demands of universal moral law, unlike, say, an artist creating something based purely on their unique vision or whim.
Exactly. The constraints are absolute. And this whole project, shaping your character, valuing yourself as this bearer of moral values, this constitutes a particular kind of flourishing for Kant, a type of eudaimonia. But again, it's not about feeling happy all the time in the hedonistic sense. It's a moral ideal of flourishing. It integrates deep self-respect, valuing yourself as a rational being capable of following the universal law with respect for all other rational beings. And within this framework of self-respect and duty, there is room to pursue happiness, but only as long as that pursuit stays within the strict boundaries of morality. Duty always comes first. And achieving this kind of moral self-affirmation, this style, it demands serious self-knowledge. You have to constantly engage in deep self-reflection. What are my real maxims? What are my true commitments driving my actions? Am I really acting out of duty, or is there some hidden self-interest, some impurity lurking underneath? You have to examine your practical life to see if your principles hold up to reason.
Okay, now we hit that tension point. Because when you use phrases like giving style and self-creation, it really echoes thinkers who came later, ones who pushed back against Kant's absolute focus on duty. People influenced by Nietzsche who often argue Kant's system denies real, warm self-love in favor of something colder, like mere self-respect. How does Nietzsche's vision of autonomy stack up against Kant's moral agent?
It's a really insightful comparison because, on the surface, there are these surprising structural similarities, even though the foundations are radically different. Think about Nietzsche's idea of the sovereign individual in the genealogy of morals. This is Nietzsche's picture of ethical maturity, an individual who has mastered themselves to the point where they can reliably make promises, impose binding norms on themselves, and give authentic expression to their own unique character, their own will. They are free because they legislate for themselves.
Right, so both Kant and Nietzsche are after this self-governing individual. But for Kant, the law they follow is universal reason, whereas for Nietzsche, it seems to come from the individual's unique will to power, their own specific nature.
That's the core of it. And this self-legislation in Nietzsche finds expression in what he calls true self-love, which is encapsulated in the idea of amor fati, love of fate. Well, amor fati isn't just liking yourself. It's this deep, powerful affirmation of everything about your existence, your strengths, your weaknesses, your joys, your sufferings, all of it, seeing it all as necessary, as part of the style you give to your character. It's almost an artistic self-creation, embracing the totality of who you are. And Nietzsche contrasts this with pseudo-self-love, which is just seeking comfort or pleasure. And here's where you see the parallels. Both Kant and Nietzsche emphasize self-mastery. Both systems require a continuous, often difficult struggle against internal weaknesses or external pressures. Both see self-affirmation and shaping oneself through long-term commitments as absolutely essential to a meaningful life.
Interesting overlaps. But despite those structural echoes, you said the foundations are different. Where does that difference really bite? If they looked at the same person trying to live ethically, what would they disagree on?
The fundamental disagreement is about what gives the self its value. Nietzsche would argue that Kant's morality, based on duty and universal law, ultimately leads to self-respect, not true self-love. You value yourself because you have the dignity of being a rational agent subject to the law. For Nietzsche, that's too thin, too denies the vibrant, unique self. Nietzsche wants you to affirm yourself because of your unique strength, your creativity, your amor fati, because of the specific style you've imposed on the chaos of your existence. The value comes from the creation. For Kant, the value comes from aligning yourself with the universal. So imagine someone who follows duty perfectly but lives a very conventional, maybe passionless life. Kant would say, excellent, that person has moral worth. Nietzsche might look at that same person and say, where's the fire? Where's the self-overcoming? Where's the true affirmation of this particular life? The value source is different. Universal law versus individual will.
Right, and the moment you bring in universal law and duty, you inevitably bring in struggle and sacrifice. Which leads us neatly into Section 5, the role of happiness. If Kantian moral development is this constant struggle, sometimes painful, often requiring you to put duty before your own desires, where does personal happiness fit in? It feels like it always takes a back seat.
It does take a back seat, but it's not thrown out of the car entirely. That's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings of Kant, that he wants everyone to be miserable in the name of duty. Not quite. Kant absolutely recognizes happiness as the natural end for human beings. It's a natural necessity, as he puts it. We're finite creatures with needs and desires, and seeking well-being is just part of our nature.
Yeah.
Maxims related to seeking happiness are perfectly acceptable, even necessary for, getting through life.
Okay, so if it's natural and necessary, why isn't morality just about finding the smartest, most rational way to maximize happiness? Maybe for everyone. Utilitarianism, sort of.
Because, for Kant, happiness cannot be the foundation of morality. Why? Because morality, to be truly moral, must have absolute, unconditional authority. If the reason you follow a moral rule is because it makes you happy or leads to good outcomes, then the rule isn't commanding you unconditionally anymore. It becomes contingent on feelings or results. Think about it. If doing your duty suddenly made you miserable or led to bad consequences, and your reason for doing it was happiness, you'd logically stop doing it. For Kant, that undermines the very idea of moral duty. The moral law commands irrespective of how you feel about it or what results it brings personally. So the key concept here is subordination, not exclusion. Kant isn't saying never pursue happiness. He's saying pursue happiness, but only within the strict limits set by the moral law. Duty comes first, always. In fact, sometimes pursuing your own happiness can even be an indirect duty. If you let yourself fall into complete despair or ruin your health through neglect, you might become incapable of fulfilling your duties. So you have a kind of duty to maintain a basic level of well-being precisely so that you can remain an effective moral agent.
That requires incredible self-discipline, though, to be able constantly to say, okay, this feels good, I want this, but does it align with duty? No. Okay, then I sacrifice the feeling for the principle, and to do that consistently.
It absolutely does. It's the core of that self-mastery we talked about. And this all points towards Kant's ultimate ideal, the supreme good, or the summum bonum. This is the theoretical state where perfect virtue, which is the highest good within our power, is perfectly united with happiness, our natural end. It's the ideal condition where being morally good also leads to being happy. Now, Kant was realistic. He thought achieving this perfectly in this life is unlikely, maybe impossible, which is one reason he needed postulates like God and immortality to make ultimate sense of it. But practically speaking, striving for the summum bonum means recognizing that morality isn't just an individual internal affair. It has a social and political dimension. We actually have a duty to try and promote the conditions in the world where virtue can lead to happiness for everyone, as long as promoting that happiness doesn't violate moral laws itself, of course.
So the goal expands beyond just my personal moral scorecard. It includes trying to shape a world where being good is ideally compatible with living a fulfilled life for myself and others. Okay, that's the perfect bridge to our final section, thinking about how all this applies today. We've been deep in some pretty abstract Kantian ideas, radical evil, maxims, the summum bonum. If moral transformation is fundamentally this personal, internal project, what does it say about our responsibility for huge systemic problems like, say, global poverty or climate change, or deep-seated injustices? What does the Kantian agent owe the world now?
Well, while the engine of the Kantian project is internal, the struggle with maxims and radical evil, it definitely has outward implications, especially when you bring in that duty related to the summum bonum, the idea of promoting universal well-being aligned with virtue. Our sources really suggest that this implies a form of collective responsibility. If we live within, and maybe benefit from, social or economic structures that are inherently unjust structures that, for instance, prevent people from having the basic security needed to even think about moral development, let alone pursue happiness, then we can't just focus on our own internal purity. By participating in these systems, we become partially responsible for the injustices they create. We can't fully affirm ourselves as moral agents, respecting the dignity of all persons, if we turn a blind eye to conditions that systematically undermine that dignity and autonomy in others.
Okay, that really connects the internal to the external. So it's not enough to just say, make sure my maxim isn't about exploiting others. If the system I'm part of facilitates exploitation, I have some duty to address the system too. How does an individual, focused on their own internal revolution of the heart, even begin to tackle something massive like climate change using Kantian principles?
It has to start with maxims, yes, but then translate into action. First, you examine your own maxims related to consumption, political participation. Your interactions, are you contributing to the problem through your choices, your principles? Are your maxims universalizable in a world facing climate crisis? But then, yes, the duty to promote the conditions for universal flourishing implies engaging in collective action and advocating for systemic reform. It means working with others to create social and political structures that are rational, respect rights, and make it possible for everyone to live a morally compatible life. The internal revolution needs to be mirrored by, or at least contribute to, a collective effort towards a more just world. And acknowledging this collective dimension also reinforces the idea of unavoidable imperfection. Just as perfect personal virtue is likely unattainable, creating a perfectly just world that fully realizes the summum bonum is also probably beyond our reach. We remain flawed, susceptible to radical evil, living in flawed systems, so the struggle is constant, both internally and externally. The goal isn't perfection, maybe, but to strive continuously to act as, basically good, well-ordered, unified agents, treating others always as ends in themselves. even amidst the messiness of real life.
So it's a dual front, isn't it? The internal battle against our own tendency to prioritize self-love over duty, and the external effort to create conditions where everyone has a fair shot at moral flourishing and compatible happiness. It's a huge ongoing demand. Right. So we've journeyed through Kant's ethical world today, seeing it not as just rules, but this intense, lifelong project of self-creation. It's fueled by constantly examining and revising our core principles, our maxims. It involves using the productive pain of repentance to recognize our freedom and recommit. And it aims ultimately at this state of self-affirmation, of moral flourishing. We also contrasted this with each's fiery call for self-love through Amor Fati, highlighting that tension between duty-based self-respect and a more maybe artistic affirmation of individual character. At the end of the day, the Kantian moral agent seems to live under these two immense pressures: the absolute, non-negotiable authority of the moral law and the constant internal need to fight off the gravitational pull of self-love that wants to undermine that law. It's that sustained, rational revolution of the heart that ultimately defines our worth.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to really chew on. If Kant is right that recognizing our freedom through acknowledging our guilt is actually key to affirming ourselves, well, what specific maxim, what ingrained habit of prioritizing yourself over what's right are you genuinely willing to confront and try to change? And what are you willing to potentially give up in terms of comfort, convenience, maybe even short-term happiness to truly affirm yourself, not just as free, but as a moral agent committed to the good? What part of this whole demanding project feels like the biggest challenge to you personally? That's definitely something worth